Hello, everyone, and welcome to the NeoSystems CMMC Town Hall. Now I'd like to introduce your host, Ed Bassett from NeoSystems. Ed?
Thanks, Don. Welcome, everyone, to our continuing series of Town Hall Ask Me Anything sessions on the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. My guest today, joining me from Key West, is Jeff Dalton, although with the Matrix background, maybe it's not really Key West, maybe a simulation of Key West, I don't know. But thanks for.
I don't know. That's the point. Yeah.
I do want to mention at the start that we are recording these sessions as part of our community outreach to the Defense Industrial Base. Our focus at NeoSystems as a managed service provider is primarily on serving the needs of organizations that are seeking certification under CMMC. That's who we have in our audience today. If you do have some questions for Jeff, please send them in on the Q&A feature within Zoom, and I'll try to work those into the conversation. I'll start with introduction. Jeff is President and CEO of Broadsword Solutions Corporation. They're a process innovation firm that brings high performance to organizations using evidence-based frameworks like Agile and CMMI to radically improve their performance. His background includes extensive work with the CMMI Institute and writing and speaking on Agile methods. He also volunteers as the Vice Chairman and now the Chairman-elect of the Board of Directors of the CMMC Accreditation body. So Jeff, welcome. Thank you for beaming in from Key West.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. And while I can't endorse any one company, I always enjoy our talks together. And I think the webinars you guys are doing are great. And I appreciate the great intro. I just want to remind everybody I'm here as a representative of the accreditation body, and we won't be talking about my other endeavors during this call. That's my fiduciary responsibility announcement.
Appreciate that, and thanks for the credit without some endorsement, and thank you for joining us. I know you've been on this series multiple times. The last time you were here was March, and a lot has changed since then.
Yeah.
We've all been watching, discussing in great detail sometimes the CMMC 2.0 announcement. So I'll just start with that from an AB perspective. How do those changes that were announced impact on the AB's mission and your priorities?
Sure, that's a really interesting question because, of course, there have been some major changes to the model itself announced. You know, the reduction in scope of the model is something everybody's talking about. There's been discussions, changes in the scope of companies that will need to, in other words, the organizations seeking certifications, the numbers of those have been reduced somewhat. But as far as the system, the need to have C3PAOs, assessors, RPs and RPOs, training classes, certification, all of those things that the AB volunteers and now the professional staff have worked so hard to establish in the last couple of years, none of that really changes. So for us, one of the things people aren't always clear on is that the accreditation body is a licensing and certification organization. We don't own the CMMC model. We're not there to provide expert cybersecurity guidance for the nation. Our job is to operate the system, or the ecosystem, we call it sometimes. And we call it that because that's what it is. And that hasn't changed that much. We still have to have all of the roles that we had. Anyone who's applied to be a C3PO and RPO, all of those things are still going forward as planned. We have had to sort of change our communications profile a little bit. Of course, people are unsure of what's going to happen in the future and what's going to happen next. But as far as the mission goes, our mission stays the same. We're here to build an infrastructure that can effectively scale to protect the nation against adversaries, and that hasn't changed at all.
Agree. The adversaries haven't.
That hasn't changed. Yeah.
2.0, that's for sure.
Yeah.
So the DoD mentioned that they had 850 public comments that came in on the interim rule that they published a year ago. That wasn't all about CMMC, but certainly a big piece of it was. In the AB, I'm sure you've heard all these comments, probably hundreds, maybe thousands more. So leading up to CMMC 2.0, what were you hearing as sort of dominant themes in the feedback that you heard? Yeah. And did the DoD address those themes? Like, did they hit on the things that you were hearing as the most significant?
Yeah, so there were a number of avenues to get feedback. So the comments were one of them, of course. and they did get about 800 on the rule, and they weren't all about CMMC, as you said. The other was an internal study that was conducted by the DoD, led by the DCMA, where they came to some of the same conclusions that were manifested in the commentary. And then a third avenue was the GAO did a study, and they found that there were deep concerns about cost, not just cost. Well, interesting. So cost for the ramp up and the creation of processes and infrastructure to support CMMC compliance, especially for small business, and the resource commitment. So the amount of time and effort and energy it was going to take a company to actually achieve CMMC compliance. And so that theme was, those two things were everywhere. Everyone was talking about those. And so it wasn't surprising to me, and some of this stuff we had some advance notice on. It wasn't surprising to me that there was a descoping, reduction in cost to achieve whatever the requirements are for instance, self-assessment for level 1. Those kind of things were prevalent in the commentary and in the study. So I wasn't really shocked to see that those were at least for now, were the solutions to those problems. It does, descoping makes a lot of sense. 300,000 companies is a huge number that probably was never going to happen anytime soon. So I think we endorse and welcome descoping, because even with the descoping that they've described, that they are going to place into a new rule eventually, is still a really large number, and there still leaves us a lot of work to do. It's still the largest of its kind in the world. So those things all came, sort of the stars kind of aligned, I guess is what I'm getting at, that we all agreed descoping made sense, and then they did that, and that also was a lot of things that were in the commentary. So everyone's on the same page, I think.
I agree. It seemed to hit a lot of the buttons of things that we were having discussions with people about. There were a couple surprises in there, but there were a lot of things where you're like, okay, everybody's talking about this. It's got to be addressed, and they did, which was made me certainly happy to see that.
Yeah.
They took these things seriously and said, well, let's come up with a solution, albeit always a compromise, right? But still,
right. Right. The big issue was scale and scope, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
cost,
and cost, right? And we can debate, did they do this exact thing the way I would have, or did they make this choice that I would have made? And we might come up with some different answers. But generally speaking, everyone's on the same page. This needed to be smaller and leaner and less costly. And one of the reasons I chose my Matrix background today is because my favorite line from the movie The Matrix is, this smells like the air of inevitability. And so a year ago, when we were looking at 300,000 companies and the kind of numbers that the DoD was hoping to accomplish, it was sort of in the air that this had to be descoped, this had to be made smaller, because anyone who's built large scale systems knows that if you try to build a massive system for the first time, it makes a lot of sense to descope it and iterate through it and come up with a smaller solution that everybody can actually live with, even though it's not perfect. And that's exactly what 2.0 does. And I wholeheartedly agree with the choice to do that.
That's going to bump the Matrix up in my rewatch queue for sure. All right, so so CMMC has a whole bunch of changes that I guess in my mind qualify as significant. The one that stuck out to me, and I was on a panel recently and they asked this question, what was most significant? And the one I picked was the bifurcation of CUI into two categories. So for those with critical CUI, they need the C3PAO assessment to get level 2. And for those with don't have critical, presumably non-critical CUI, self-assessment. So that's the descoping that you mentioned. This seems to me like it could be a slider that DoD could control dynamically. And I guess, we don't know for sure what the rule is going to say, but the way it was described, it started like they could start off as designating maybe a small amount of CUI as critical. And then later, as the ecosystem builds out, there's more C3POs, et cetera, they could slide that over and decide that more things are critical. Right? And then,
that's right. Yeah.
Is that the intent, do you think?
Yeah, I think the intent is to iterate through it and to start with a smaller number. I've heard, there's no official number, but I've heard various DoD officials talk about 25% of level 2 candidates will fall in that category, and I've heard others say 50%. So I think they're going to, this is speculation, probably. I guess it's speculation, but I would guess they're going to start a little bit smaller and see how it works out, and then adjust that scale as they learn more. And you know what? That's exactly the way these things are supposed to work. A lot of people are complaining or making noise about how come they don't have an exact number. And when you don't know the exact number, you start with a small number and you slide the scale as you learn more. And that makes complete
right. Yep.
It makes complete sense. My background in the software side of my job is in the Agile community, and that's everything they did was very much in line with the Agile community. It's iterate through it, start small, descope. All these things make a ton of sense. So I'm glad they did all of them.
Yeah, as a person of some age, I watched this rollout in the PCI and the credit card across the retail sector, right, where you had, again, millions, in that case, millions of companies that you needed to touch, and so they were strategic about how they did it. It took several years to get it done, but it had the desired effect, and not without a little trial and error. I should point out, for any of us who live
sure, and no one's going to agree on every detail, and I don't necessarily agree with every detail, but we have a path forward. We're going to be able to iterate. We're going to learn, and I don't think that CUI question is the only thing that's going to slide. I think we're going to start seeing other changes as we learn more, and that's a good thing.
So that was my kind of most significant. What would be your kind of most significant of the changes? Which one do you float to the top of the bucket there?
Yeah, mine's probably less obvious, but the thing I really liked about CMMC was that it had a requirement to demonstrate maturity. It had a requirement to say, I've been doing this for a while, and this is how we run our company. And so if you think about the word maturity, it means things are persistent, things are habitual. It represents your culture and who you are and how you run your company. And the only way to make that work at scale is to codify it in the model. So for instance, CMMI has that in the model, the requirement to not only demonstrate you're doing something, but demonstrate that you have been doing it for a credible period of time. And I call that longevity in my world. And the CMMC had the requirement to demonstrate this longevity or maturity, and that was descoped with version 2.0. So I think that that's pretty significant. It's going to reduce the cost, obviously, because companies that maybe are deficient in certain practices won't need that much time or effort to actually address them. Where with a maturity component built into it, they might need a significant amount of time to address them to prove that they're actually doing it, depending on what it is. Some of it could be quick, but so that, to me, that was the most significant part, and it was also one of the top comments and feedback that we received from companies, that they were concerned about this practice and how it would make it difficult for them to actually achieve level 3.
I agree on the significance for sure. So I got a couple of audience questions on descoping. One is specifically on that maturity item. This audience member asks, what will the MM stand for going forward if they're stripping out the maturity requirements?
I've heard a couple of people ask that question already. Is it still a maturity model? And it is. Okay, so there's two different definitions, I should say. Two different definitions of maturity in this context. One is the practices that were in the model themselves that defined, is this a mature set of practices? So that's the one I was just talking about. But CMMC is still an evolutionary model that as you move up in the levels, you demonstrate increased performance and increased maturity in cybersecurity. So the fact that it still has level 1, 2, and 3, and level 1 is still, I have some new names, but level 1, you can think of it as basic price of admission kinds of stuff, like, do people log in when they enter the building, and do they have password changes and virus protection or whatever it happens to be? And I'm not quoting from the model, I'm just speaking in generalities. And level 2 has more advanced types of things, and of course level 3 has very advanced types of things. It's still by definition a maturity model. It just doesn't have that requirement for longevity built into it anymore.
And I think, to be able to pass a third-party audit requires a level of maturity And now
Yeah.
this new model, it's up to the company to decide how best to do that. If you like to try to pass your audit by scrabbling together emails and hoping you can get it all done in time for the auditor, that's good. If you'd rather use a systematic approach, maybe cheaper, maybe more likely to succeed. I don't know. Well, I do know.
Yeah,
I do it for
I would hope, I hope companies will take a more systemic approach, because that's what we need to protect, our data. But there are always, and we see this in CMMI, there's always companies that they're literally their only interest in passing the assessment is so they can bid on work, and they have zero other interest. And there's going to be companies like that with the kind of numbers that we have. And I think that that's sort of unethical from the standpoint then that you're exposing your customers' data to our adversaries when you do that. But we're going to see some of that, I'm sure.
I might call it penny wise and pound foolish too, because
you
then suffer a breach, and that breach costs you and your company and the government and national security lots of money. That you may find that to have been not a wise decision.
It's the same old adage with everything else: you pay now or you pay later. And the problem with paying later is it hurts a lot more people.
So related question, do you think maturity can come back as CMMC progresses through the years? Do you think that might re-enter the standard?
I don't have any insight into whether it would. I hope it re-enters the standards, and I hope that we see it getting back into the model, but I don't have any way of projecting that.
Next audience question on the descoping. The audience member says, I hear many certifiers and assessors complaining about the reduction in opportunities and profit due to the self-attestation capability and the leaner requirements. Will this drive audit and or assessment costs up as they compensate for this profit shortfall, do you think?
Yeah, so I think I've done a few webinars just on this subject. I want to just sort of bust a myth there. This is still a massive program. The numbers for just level 2 are running between, depending on who you talk to, 40 to 80,000 companies. That's just DoD. And one thing people aren't talking about is for the level 3 that are going to be done by DCMA, they have to first pass an assessment at level 2 given by a C3PAO assessor. So that's another group of folks. And all of them have to pass a level 1 when they're doing a level 2 or 3 assessment. So the number is not as small. People have said, somebody said to me the other day, the market has collapsed. I'm like, man, if I wasn't on the board, I would start a C3PO today, because give me a collapsed market with 80,000 companies any day of the week, right? And so it's, I don't agree with the premise that the market is dramatically different. I don't think the market was ever going to be 300,000, at least not at any time in the next decade. And I'm very happy that it's 40 to 80,000. So I don't know. The premise, I think, is incorrect. It's undeniable that it's a smaller number, but the question is was it ever going to actually be the larger number? And I don't really think it was. So I think it's still a very, very healthy market. And I don't see it really affecting pricing at all, because we still aren't going to have, if you do the math, 40,000, let's say it's 40,000. If you do the math, how many assessors do you need? Well, you need 1,000 assessors, right? Because these things don't take a few days to execute. If you do 1 or 2 a month, you're going to be really busy. So we don't have 1,000 assessors. We have 173 right now. So we have a huge market and not enough people to do the work right now.
There's generally a shortage in this whole cybersecurity area anyway, right? So we didn't need to make more work for the people who don't exist. We need to find more efficient ways of achieving our goals. So, ways that are less resource intensive, less people intensive. And, one of the things I talk about in some of my outings is, people ask me, how do I handle the shortage in personnel? And they're thinking I'm going to talk about training, recruiting, and stuff like that. And I usually talk about automation and operational efficiency. You just need less people if you can do it in ways that are you get a high amount of reuse and that sort of thing. So I think that same thing's going to be true in your ecosystem as well. The market's going to look for efficiencies.
That's right. Yeah. And even for the self-attestation, there's going to be a need for for help there, because now we're talking about, or the DoD is talking about, CXOs or board directors signing off on their self-assessments. And that in order to manage risk, and if I was a CEO of a good size prime, I'd be bringing in somebody like a C3PO or an RPO to do that self-assessment, because even though it's not a certified assessment, because I want to manage that risk and I want an expert to sign off on it if my name's going to be on the report.
Agreed. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Let's discuss the timing a little bit. So DoD said this is sort of the big number that's been put out there is 9 to 24 months for rulemaking, but there's a lot going on while the DoD is going through that rulemaking process. So let's maybe step through what the AB is going to do, what the DIB is going to do. So let's start with AB. What is the AB going to be working on during this interim process while the rulemaking is happening?
Sure. Well, I want to make sure everybody gets that there will be assessments starting soon, and they'll be starting against the 2.0 spec.
Great.
But what won't happen is it won't show up as a contractual requirement for the bid process. So that is definitely going to be delayed, as far as I know. But we're told by the DoD that assessments will start, that there'll be folks that want to get assessments, so organizations actually seeking assessments and certifications, and the DoD is working on incentivizing companies to go ahead and get this done. And we already know of hundreds of companies who have inquired to the AB that would like to have an assessment done as quickly as the DoD will allow. So the AB is going to be operating as planned, but at the same time, we have some, and when I say we, I mean the professional staff, because I'm on the board, and the board no longer has operational responsibilities. The staff will be focused on modifying class content, modifying exam content. In other words, bringing the materials up to 2.0 standards. And it's a de-scoping, right? So these materials have already been developed and these exams are already well on their way. So they'll have to be de-scoped, which isn't going to be a huge job. It is going to be some effort. So we'll be doing that. And at the same time, the staff will continue their ramp up and continue the work that they've been doing.
So what about the DIB, I guess? So for people in the DIB, where should their focus be during this 9 to 24 months? You mentioned voluntarily getting assessed, so that certainly could be on the agenda for the early adopter crowd.
Sure. Yeah. It's a great question, because it brings me back to what I've said since the very beginning with CMMC. These companies should be focused on the same thing they were supposed to be focusing on, which was making their environment secure and not letting adversaries get to their data and manipulate the data and steal the data. They were supposed to be doing that before. They should be doing that now. And CMMC doesn't change that. Sometimes I get a little bit frustrated because I hear people talk about, oh, it's going to be so hard and expensive for us to ramp up to CMMC. No, it's not. It's going to be hard for you to ramp up to protecting your information adequately. See, all CMMC is a checklist that says, are you doing this right? And if you're not, meeting the intent of the model, then you're putting your customers and your data at risk. You're putting the nation at risk. So what DIB companies should be working on is they should be working on making sure that their data and their networks are protected and that they are up to speed on all of the requirements for CMMC, because all it really is now is NIST 800, 171, and then some new things that are coming out. And they were supposed to be doing that already. So keep doing what you were doing, or what you were supposed to be doing, I guess I should say.
And you can make a good point that there's nothing in those requirements, not a single requirement where the justification is DoD told me to do it, right? All those have a real business and threat justification behind them.
Right.
So
yeah,
could and should.
There's been a number of people like in the media writing, fairly inflammatory stories about the cost of CMMC. It's going to cost $500,000. It's going to cost $1 million. And no, the assessment is going to cost, depends who you are and what it is, but this assessment is going to cost under $100,000 somewhere, probably in the lower numbers. The ramp up to become compliant with CMMC is nothing more than the ramp up to protect your information from adversaries. And that's not a CMMC cost or effort. That's a national security effort.
Blame it on the threat if you want. So
it's caused by our adversaries. Yeah.
Blame them. It seems like the 2.0 changes, they're making it easier to speed up the rollout schedule. So you talked about descoping, making it simpler, kind of easing the entry. So once that rulemaking concludes, what are your expectations in terms of the rollout? I mean, we had before this kind of undefined 5-year rollout where the DoD was going to put it into contracts as they saw fit. Now everybody's had a head start, and the barriers to entry have been lowered.
Yeah.
Could that rollout be faster?
Yeah, I think the rollout was pretty well defined from the standpoint of how many assessments they were going to require each year. So those numbers were pretty well defined. I would expect them to come right. I would expect them to come out with a schedule, once they have the 2.0 spec rule completed. I would imagine it's going to be a little bit faster than the original one, but I don't have information on what that's going to look like yet.
So you mentioned the potential for voluntary assessments ahead of a contractual requirement. So last week I read an article, this was not an official DoD release, but it said that they may be talking about acquisition preference, especially maybe scoring a contractor higher if they have the certification.
That's right.
I'm assuming that's something that you would support. It helps support your ecosystem and it gets you started doing things sooner. What are your thoughts on the incentive and how that may play out in the marketplace?
Well, there's a working model for this in the DoD already, and that's CMMI. CMMI at one point in the early 2000s was a mandate, just like CMMC is going to be. And around 2010 or so, they turned it into an incentive program. So in other words, if you had CMMI level 3, you were given more points on your RP response. And if you had ISO 9001 and ISO 27001 and any number of other standards, there's a point system, and I'd like to see them do something like that, and so that companies will voluntarily. I love the word voluntold. It's one of my favorite words in our business, and I think some of that is voluntelling because the CEO of the company who wants to win that $30 million engagement will voluntel his people that, hey, we're going to do CMMC or CMMI or ISO or whatever, because we're going to win this business. And that's what it's going to take.
They say that to subcontractors. Right?
Sure.
Yeah.
And I don't know what the DoD's plan is for incentivizing, but there is a model for this in the federal government now, and that's the CMMI model. And it works very well. All kinds of contracts say, not required, but if you want the extra 300 points or 1,000 points or whatever the point system is on the contract, you'll demonstrate to us that you're level 1, 2, or 3 or whatever. I would love to see something like that, and I think that would really jumpstart the incentivization of CMMC.
Got a related audience question that they ask if you're going through a successful DIBCAC audit, so the DIBCAC's still out there doing audits, right? If you go through a successful DIBCAC high assessment, would that result in a CMMC certification? Like, will you and the AB recognize that, or is it even up to you? Maybe it's a DoD decision. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't have an official answer for that. I understand the question because it effectively becomes the same model, right? CMMC and the DIBCAC high assessment. I understand the premise of the question. I just don't have an official answer to that.
Got it.
Good question.
Yeah, I thought so. It makes sense to have some reciprocity there.
Maybe, yeah.
What, maybe just a kind of a fly up to 50,000 foot kind of question, and then we'll wrap things up for today. But take us forward. If we all band together, we all do the right things, the ecosystem, the DIB, the service providers, the tech vendors, what in your mind does success look like for CMMC program? Like if you play it forward, if all goes well, which I think it will, where does it take us?
There's a few moving parts, or quite a few moving parts actually, but it really all comes back to this incentive program. So if, to me, it would be successful if the proper incentives were put in place. So we saw like we do in CMMI, we saw thousands of companies requesting assessments, and that required the AB to continue to ramp up to, let's say, I'm just making up a number, but 400 or 500 assessors and a couple of hundred C3PAOs that in turn required all the training and certification, and that there was a healthy consulting and coaching through the RP and RPOs who are independent of the AB, but they're registered. I'd like to see that kind of ecosystem blossom in that way to support 25 or 50,000 companies in the next couple of years that assess themselves voluntarily. If we do that, we'll be able to start small and iterate through a smaller than expected number, but still a very large number. That number dwarfs CMMI and ISO in the federal space, by the way, even if it's 50,000. So we'll be able to iterate through that and learn a lot, and so will the DoD. And the AB will also be able to expand out, into other areas of the government at that point. So I think there's a lot of great potential for success. We have a great model. We have a great ecosystem. We have some great leadership with Matt, Travis, and our friends at the DoD. So, I think this is going to work out great, and everybody's really happy with the scoping.
I appreciate that insight. I think, as I mentioned PCI earlier, right? We saw there was sort of, instead of every little retailer trying to figure out how to do it their own way, a lot of them, there was mass adoption of some proven solutions, right? Basically moving the burden to a service provider who was well equipped to handle it. And I think I think that's a part of this equation for sure, is mass adoption of robust, proven solutions, as opposed to 300,000 DIY solutions. But I'm in the solution business, so maybe I'm biased.
Yeah, we're actually getting ready to announce our registered, or I'm not sure what the actual name is going to be for this, but it's the idea of solutions, technical solutions that are aligned with the AB through our licensing and registration process. And we are about to announce some movement on that pretty soon. We're pretty excited.
That is exciting. And when that's out, maybe we'll have you back and we can discuss that in some detail and the impacts that has. Because I think, one of the things now is people are trying to buy in a very dynamic and frankly confusing marketplace. So everything that you do is about organizing that marketplace, right? So people can identify who's who, who's made a commitment, who hasn't.
We're not endorsing any of them, but if you look across the landscape, there's literally hundreds of companies saying, buy me, we can solve your CMMC problem. And some of them can, and some of them can. And we at least want to get that a little bit less chaotic and organized, and have people sign the code of professional conduct and make sure that they realize that we need them to be serious players. And we'll just have to see how that plays out.
Well, thank you for that. It's much needed, and it's a very, very valuable role in moving things forward.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, Jeff, thanks very much. We're over our time, which is kind of a bad habit I seem to have here on this program, but appreciate it. Appreciate your input. Wade Forbes, who's been sketchnoting this, thank you for your effort. We'll send that out to the attendees after the session. Thanks to the audience members for your great questions, for your time and attention. Please do join us for future sessions. Our next session is going to be Wednesday, the December 8th, a week from today at 1 p.m. Eastern. Our guest will be Bob Metzger, who's always insightful on the legal and regulatory side of things. If you don't have an invitation for that already in your inbox, please head to our website, neosystemscorp.com, for those details. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.